everyone, I'm Carolina and today I'm showing you how to sew the dress view of the Francesca sewing pattern without sleeves. You can find the sewing pattern for this dress and top on my website, studiocarolinashear.com. It's also linked down below in the description. If you want to sew the top view with the on-seam zipper in the back or any of the views with the sleeves, I have shorter tutorials for those specific steps, which I have also linked down below. Please take your time and go through the fit guide in the instructions. This bodice is designed to fit tightly on the body and it needs to fit correctly in order to look good. There are instructions on how to make a full bust adjustment or a small bust adjustment included in the pattern if you need to do that, and I strongly urge you to make a mock-up. If you sew this piece and post on Instagram or TikTok, please tag me at @studiocarolinashear and use the hashtag #FRANCHESCA so I can see what you make. Alright, so you're going to need some medium weight fabric. You're also going to need an invisible zipper for the dress. For the top, you need an open-ended zipper. I'm sewing my dress with shirring in the back, so I also need elastic sewing thread as well as regular sewing thread. This is the elastic sewing thread that I use. And finally, you need lightweight interfacing for the bodice pieces. Check pages 9 to 12 in the instructions for fabric consumption. If you have any questions regarding the sewing or the pattern, just send me a message. I'm always here to help. For my bodice main fabric pieces, I have one front bodice cut on fold. I have two side fronts, I have two backs, and I have two side backs. And since I'm doing shirring, I have chosen pattern piece 4S and I have notches cut all along the shirring lines. And I'm going to be placing my invisible zipper right here in the center. For my skirt, I have one front cut on fold and I have my little pocket placement here. For my back skirt, I have two backs. This is my center back, and I also have my little pocket placement. Pay attention if you are not sewing your skirt with the bottom skirt frill, you need to lengthen your skirt pieces. Follow the instructions on the pattern for that. 4 pockets, cut mirrored, and I have my bottom skirt frill. I have 2 of these cut on fold. For my lining pieces, I have one front bodice, 2 side fronts, and again, I have my 2 backs and my side backs. Remember to cut all the notches indicated on the pattern, and when you cut pieces on fold, also notch for the center. Check page 13 in the instructions for the full pattern pieces overview. Interface pattern pieces 1, 2, 3, and 4. If you are sewing the back with shirring like I am, do not interface pattern piece 4S. If your back is interfaced, you're not going to be able to shirr it. It's just not going to look good. Here I'm using a piece of fabric between my interfacing and my iron. Whenever I need to work a little extra with my iron, I'll use my scrap piece of fabric to protect my main fabric. Now I'll shirr my back pieces. If you're sewing without shirring, just skip ahead. First I will mark my shirring lines by using a friction pen. This is a heat erasable marker. I'll do this on my main fabric and on my lining, and I'll mark on the right side of the fabric. I'm just following my notches to draw these lines. Once I have my lines drawn on the fabric, I will take my elastic sewing thread and hand wind this around my bobbin. Insert that as I normally would. So I have regular sewing thread on my upper thread, elastic sewing thread on my under thread. I'll increase my stitch length. For me on my machine, 4 is good, but this differs between machines, so find what works for you. And I'll sew with a straight stitch. When you sew your shirring, start at the top of piece 4S and follow the lines to see which direction gives you the best continuity of the seam. This depends on what size you're working on. For me here, you can see it's best if I start from the right. I'll start with a back stitch to lock the elastic thread. Sew all the way off the fabric, lift my presser foot, pivot my fabric around, lower my presser foot, and continue on the second row. I'll do this for every single row, and I will not backstitch anymore until I get to the end of my piece. And I'll do this on all of my 4 back pieces. So 2 main fabric and 2 lining. And I'm sewing on the right side of the fabric. If you need more details on how to sew shirring, I have a tutorial for this, which I will link here for you, and you'll also find it in the description. Once I've sewn all my shirring, I will pin my pieces to my ironing board, jack up the steam to max on my iron, and hover above these pieces. I will not iron on top of them because then I might melt my elastic thread, but I'll hover above them, and this is going to give my shirring a more even look. It will also erase the lines from a heat erasable marker. I'll move on to my front, and I'll sew my side fronts to my front along my princess seam. You're going to need to cut notches here on the upper part of the princess seam on the front piece. So I align my bust notches on my pieces, and I'll cut my notches on my front piece in the curve above my bust notch. So I'm just pinning this together to show you why you need to do this, because the pieces won't match unless you cut these notches. On the other side, I'll just cut my notches before I even start pinning. Align my bust notches and then pin my side front to my front. I'll repeat this step on my lining. And then sew these pieces together with a straight stitch 1 centimeter seam allowance. Pay attention to not sew in any pleats in your princess seams for the best results, and you can stretch your fabric a little bit when you sew. Then I will iron these seams open. And I'll use a little piece of fabric here to protect my seams because I'm really going to work these princess seam curves. Do the same thing on your lining. And then I will cut half of my seam allowance off on the upper part of my princess seam. So just along the curve. This is to reduce bulk. Otherwise you're gonna have bulky princess seams. It's not gonna be nice. Now sew your back pieces together, match up your bust notches, and your side back has a notch for where you align the top of your back piece. So match the top of your back piece up with this notch as well. When pinning the shirring in place, make sure that you pin the edge nice and flat. It's a little tricky, but you can do it. Do this on the main fabric and the lining fabric. Then sew these pieces together with a straight stitch and 1 centimeter seam allowance. Iron the seam allowance open and then over to the back piece. Careful again to not iron directly on your elastic thread because it's going to melt. Then we're going to sew the main fabric shoulders together. And the lining fabric shoulders together. Iron these seams open. Now we're going to sew the neckline of these two bodice pieces together. So I'm going to place my lining on top of my main fabric, right sides facing each other, and just pin along the full neckline. So I'm matching up my center notch on my front pieces, my shoulders, and my seams here on the back. Then I'm stretching out my shirring to pin it flat and straight. The lining is slightly smaller than the main fabric to reduce bulk on the inside of the garment. So you just want to stretch it lightly when you pin these together. Now sew this all together with a straight stitch, 1 centimeter seam allowance. To get my neckline rounded edges really nice, I will notch these curves on the front and the back, not cutting too close to the seam. In the back here, the fabric is kind of thick, and cutting some notches is going to make it a lot easier to work with this. Then understitch the seam allowance on the lining side. Then on the lining side, iron this seam flat. You can see that I kind of flatten this seam by rolling with my fingers when I iron. Flip wrong sides out and sew the armholes together. I'm aligning my shoulder seams and just pinning along that edge. So with 1 centimeter seam allowance and a straight stitch. If you're sewing the view with the sleeves, refer to the pattern instructions because it's not the same procedure. There are QR codes in the pattern for these additional tutorials. Again, cut a couple of notches in your curves on the front and back. Then flip your piece right sides out by passing the back through the shoulder out to the front. When you've done this on both sides, open up your piece so you have lining on one side and main fabric on the other, and then sew an understitch in the armhole seam, locking the seam allowance to the lining. Start from the side seam when you do this. You're not going to be able to sew all around the armhole because the strap is too narrow. So just sew as far as you can towards the shoulder, and then do a back stitch and start sewing from the other side. And it's okay, because the lining is slightly smaller than the main fabric, it will still stay in place. So you can see here that I didn't get very far, but it's okay. I'll sew my other side. And then I'll iron all of this flat. Again, ironing on the lining side. And this is what it looks like. Flip your lining and main fabric open again to sew your side seams. I'm sewing lining fabric with lining fabric and main fabric with main fabric, and I'm aligning my armhole seam and matching up my notches. Then iron these seams open. Flip the lining down over the main fabric and iron it all flat. Now the bodice is looking kind of done. I'll flip my main fabric up and overlock or zigzag this bottom edge on my lining fabric, paying attention to locking my seam allowance in the correct position. So where it's open, I'm going to overlock it open. Where it's folded to a specific side, I will overlock it in that direction. I'll put my bodice aside and work on my skirt. I'm adding pockets to my skirt, so I will start with this. I'll overlock or zigzag my pocket attachment seams on my skirt and on my pockets. Then I'll attach my pockets to the pocket placements on the skirt and sew that together with a straight stitch and 1 centimeter seam allowance. I'll iron this open and then over to the pocket, where I'll understitch my seam allowance to the pocket sack. Now I'll overlock or zigzag around this full skirt piece except for the waist, and I'll do this on all of my skirt pieces. I'll also zigzag or overlock around the full bottom skirt frill pieces. Then I'll pin my back skirt to my front skirt on the sidelines, pinning my pockets together as well on both sides. And I'll sew this together with a straight stitch and 1 centimeter seam allowance. I'll also pin and sew my bottom skirt frill side seams together. Now I'll notch in the corners where my pocket connects to my skirt. This is just so that I can iron my seams open on the skirt and flip my pocket to the front of the skirt. Because when I wear it and use my pockets, I'll be placing my hands towards my front and not my back. And this is how my inseam pocket looks. So nice and clean. I'll iron the side seams open on my bottom skirt frill as well. And I will also take this opportunity to prepare my bottom double folded hem. I like to use my overlocking seam as a guide when I prepare my hem. So I'll do my first fold at the top of my overlocking stitch and then just fold it over, enclosing my overlocking stitch inside. So I'm just doing 5mm double folded and ironing that down all along my bottom skirt frill. If you are not sewing the bottom skirt frill, you can prepare your hem on your skirt instead. Now I'll sew my gathering stitches along the waist of my skirt. Also 2 gathering stitches within the 1cm seam allowance I have along my waist. And when I sew gathering stitches, I like to do it in sections in case one seam breaks or it's just easier. So what I do is I sew from center back to side seam and then side seam all along to side seam and then side seam to center back. The first one is going to be 2 to 3mm from the edge. The second one is going to be 7mm from the edge. I'll also sew my 2 gathering stitches on my bottom skirt frill the exact same way, and I will section this up by sewing side seam to side seam and side seam to side seam. I'll increase my stitch length to max. I don't sew a back stitch when I do gathering stitches. So here at the side seam, I finished my first seam and I'll start my second seam. Again, no back stitches. I'll show you a hack for how to gather fabric quickly without a gathering foot. So I'll sew my first gathering stitch as before, normally, and then when I sew my second gathering stitch, I will pull on my upper thread, not too much, but a little bit. This is going to gather the fabric automatically because of the tension in the thread. I'll just sew a couple of stitches before I start pulling on my thread so I don't pull my thread out of the needle, and then I'll start putting some tension on that thread. And you can see as I'm sewing that this is gathering the fabric automatically. I'll still be doing my gathering in sections. So here I've sewn my first section, I'm going to start on my second one. Okay, now I will attach my skirt to my bodice. So my skirt is a lot larger than my bodice and it's not gathered yet. So what I'll do is I'll match my skirt notches to my bodice notches. I'll fold away my lining, and since my skirt waist is a lot larger than my bodice waist, I'll start with matching up my notches and my seams. On my skirt front, I have notches to match with my princess seams. On the back skirt, again, I have notches to match with the seam where the side back meets the back. And of course my fold notch there on the center front. Now you can see that I have all this excess on my skirt waist, and I'll pull on my under thread to gather the waist to fit the waist of the bodice. The reason why I pin it before I gather it is because this is going to give me a more harmonious skirt volume, with the gathers evenly distributed around the full body. Once the skirt is pinned to the bodice, I'll attach that with a straight stitch and 1cm seam allowance, making sure that the gathering stitches on my skirt is within my seam allowance value. I can now cut off all of this excess thread. And I'll iron this seam allowance up into the bodice. And now I'll attach my invisible zipper. So again, with the lining folded away, I decided to change the color of my invisible zipper here because I just felt like the other one was too dark, but ignore that. I'll open my invisible zipper, and this little top bit there, I will align that to where my main fabric meets my lining fabric. If you're sewing the top view and not the dress view, the zipper is different. It uses an on-seam zipper. Check out the tutorial for that. It's linked in the description, and follow the instructions in the pattern. I'll pin my zipper in place. Then I'll just zip it up past the waist. I'll make a little mark at the waistline with my heat erasable marker. This is so that I can perfectly align the waist on the other side. Then I'll open my zipper and I'll pin my waistline on the other side to where I made this mark. And then I'll pin that full side of the zipper as well. I'll switch out my presser foot to my zipper foot. Sew a basting stitch to keep my zipper in place. I'll do this on both sides of my zipper. This will allow me to remove my pins and check that my seams and edges are perfectly aligned. Now I'll sew my final zipper stitch, and when I do this, I will roll open my zipper teeth and sew as close to them as possible. So I'll just keep rolling away the zipper teeth with my fingers as I sew, really pressing the needle and zipper foot as close as possible without sewing on the zipper teeth. Again, I'll do both sides of the zipper. When the zipper is attached, I'll fold away or cut off this top bit of the zipper and align the top edge of the zipper to where the main fabric and lining meet. I prefer to fold it down and cut it later, so I'll just pin it down, and then I'll fold my lining over the zipper so that my zipper is sandwiched in between the lining and the main fabric. I'll make sure that my seam allowance is also fully folded over. I'll pin my lining edge to edge with the zipper edge, and then I'll sew my lining to the zipper and main fabric along this edge. When the lining is attached, I'll cut this top corner off because it has all the bulk from the top of my zipper. Careful not to cut too close to the seam though. Then I'll flip my right sides out, pull my zipper out at the top there. I'll close my zipper and verify that it's good. Now is a great time to try your piece on because you can still access the bodice seams to make some small adjustments. I'll pin my skirt center back together a little bit past where my zipper stitch starts, and I'll sew along this edge and just pass my zipper stitch slightly. This will ensure a really clean finish. I'll iron the seam allowance open, and then here you can barely see where the zipper starts. Don't get discouraged if you struggle with zippers. It takes practice, but every time you do it, you're gonna get better. Now I'll attach my bottom skirt frill to my skirt, and since I already kind of gathered this on my machine, it's going to go a lot quicker, and I also don't have as many notches to match up. I have my side seams to match up and then my center notches to match up. So I'll do that first. I'll just pin them in place, and then I will make sure that the gathers are even along the rest of the edge. I'll sew that together with a straight stitch and 1 centimeter seam allowance. If you want less volume on your bottom skirt frill, iron the seam allowance up into the skirt. If you want more volume, iron the seam allowance down into the bottom skirt frill. Next up, I will lock my lining to my skirt, so I'll close my bodice, and I'll do this with a stitch in the ditch in my waist seam. So I'll just take my lining here on the inside and I'll pin it down to the skirt and the main fabric bodice. And I'll pull it slightly when I do this, just to make sure that it lays flat against the body. Don't pull it too much because it's gonna look weird. Just pull it so that it's flat. That's enough. Match up your notches and your seams and stretch out the shirring on the back when you pin it. I'll just go really slowly to do my stitch in the ditch to make sure that I get a nice finish. If you find this difficult, you can also hand stitch the lining closed. And that's what it looks like. My final step is stitching down my hem that I prepared earlier. So since I already ironed it, I don't need to pin it. I will just top stitch it down. And that's my dress fully done. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this tutorial helpful, please consider liking and subscribing. It really helps me out. And if you do sew this piece and post on Instagram or TikTok, please tag me at Studio Carolina Shear and use the hashtag #CORSET. That way I can see what you make. That's it for this video, and I'll see you next time. Bye!